Okay, so if you watched that video, hopefully you got a couple laughs out of it and you got the idea of what he was trying to talk about, right? The idea that, men and women's brains might be different. I'm not sure his characterizations are fair or appropriate for either sex, but, he was trying to be funny. And we'll come back to that issue in a little bit when we start to talk about gender, because he was portraying it like he was talking about sex differences, but he might have really been talking about gender. Okay, so now the last thing I wanted to say about hormonal sex is to look at this profile of how hormones fluctuate across our developmental stages. So if we look at, on the far left, it's got, at fertilization, but let's move one panel over here where you see that sort of double humped blue line. That's testosterone. And that's the roller coaster that testosterone rides during late gestation, during the fetal period. You'll notice that progesterone and estrogen are on the floor. That's the purple and the pink that's at the very bottom of the panel. Those are on the floor. There's nothing going on with those. But there's this big dose of testosterone in the people who have the Y chromosome present. And then you'll notice after birth, there's this flat period where testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, all of them are basically on the floor. Everybody's experiencing low levels of hormones. Then at puberty, all of a sudden, everything shoots up. And you see that testosterone shoots up and stays up. For the progesterone and the estrogen, you see that they go up and they go up and down and up and down and up and down. And that goes back to that menstrual cycle that we talked about before. But what I really wanted to drive your attention towards is that flat level between birth and puberty. There's little tiny blips at certain ages, but really what you're experiencing during childhood is low levels of hormones for both males and for females. If you drew the blood of a male child and compared it to the hormone pattern to the blood of a same age female child, you wouldn't really be able to tell just from the hormone levels whether one of them is male or one of them is female. Their hormone patterns look virtually identical. And that helps to explain why, like little boys on average tend to have, faces that are more feminine than they're going to be when they get older and they get exposed to testosterone. They are not experiencing testosterone during that period. So it's really important to know that hormones are not going to explain sex differences between little boys and little girls. Like, they are not behaving that way because their hormones are different. They're behaving that way either because their brain got shaped differently in the womb, or because their behavior has been shaped since they've been born. Once we get to puberty, now we could start talking about possibly, hormonal effects on behavior. But during childhood, we're going to be talking about other effects. All right, so I just really wanted to emphasize that. Now, to finish our hormonal discussion, I wanted to talk about some abnormalities that can occur that are sort of those exceptions that prove the rule kind of issues. So there's one kind of condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and it can happen in males or females, but the biggest effects would normally be noticeable in females. What happens is during fetal development, so congenital usually means that it happened during fetal development and it's been present since birth. The HPA axis that I showed you earlier malfunctions. Basically what's happening is that the parts of the adrenal cortex, that part of the adrenaline system that's supposed to be pumping out hormones in response to the HPA axis, the part that's supposed to produce the cortisol is insensitive. It can't produce the cortisol. So no matter how much the brain and the pituitary gland are saying, send out cortisol, I need some cortisol, I'm under stress, give me cortisol, it just can't respond. And so the adrenal cortex goes, well, how would you like some of these hormones instead that I also can produce? And so a bunch of testosterone will be secreted instead. So in response to the demand for cortisol, the adrenal cortex releases testosterone. Testosterone can actually help us to combat stress also by making us aggressive and things. So it's not probably the worst backup plan, but if you're a female fetus and you're being exposed to testosterone, you may have some long-term effects from that. One of those long-term effects is that it could have an effect on the developing genitals. If this whole HPA axis started to malfunction early enough in gestation, it could affect the genitals. But more likely it's going to affect the developing brain. And so when we look at girls who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and especially those who don't have, the physical symptoms, that don't have genitals that look different, but, have maybe some other symptoms that led their doctor to recognize that they had this condition, they oftentimes have behaviors that are more consistent with what one would expect of a male. They are interested in things that typically are associated with masculinity. And so it could be that the brain was shaped in the womb in a way that's more consistent with masculinity. And now as a child, as a teenager growing up, the person is experiencing just their natural predispositions because their brain is organized a little bit differently. Androgen insensitivity syndrome is exactly the opposite. This is where we have a person who has XY chromosome, but their body is not sensitive to the effects of that androgen. And so for some people, they have partial androgen insensitivity syndrome, which means that they were not insensitive prior to the development of their genitals. And so their external genitalia, their testes, their gonads have turned into testes, those kinds of things. And then it was after that they started to become insensitive to androgens. So at birth, they're recognized as male and everything appears to be male. But then as they go to develop, and especially at puberty, when the secondary sex characteristics are supposed to appear, they don't. And so you end up with a person who throughout their life will look a lot less masculine than they would have if they'd had a dose of testosterone at puberty. A person with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is a person who from the very get-go has been insensitive to the actions of androgens, and so the genitals don't fully develop in a masculine way and might be, in fact, so insensitive they might have what from the outside absolutely looks like female genitalia. So I thought I'd share with you again another video, and this one is a case of a woman who has androgen sensitivity syndrome, and I think she does such a good job of talking about it and explaining what the experience is like and stuff like that. So this will queue up in the playlist next, and then we can come back and talk about it more.